Amidst the desolate plains of Karun, where jagged black cliffs met the blood-orange sky, a solitary alien woman waited. Her form was both haunting and beautiful, tall and willowy, with skin that shimmered like silver under the dying light. Her wide, sorrowful eyes reflected the pale blue of her home's distant twin suns, which barely pierced through the thick dust storms. She clutched her children, two fragile twins, their pale luminescence dimmed by exhaustion and hunger. She had heard of him, the human warrior, whispered in the scattered ruins of her people's once thriving cities. The human who fought like the storms of Karun itself. They said he had survived battles even her kind could not fathom, that he wore a face as scarred as the land he now walked. But the story said something else, too, that despite the carnage he wrought, he had a heart that could break for the innocent. When he finally arrived, she almost did not recognize him. He was weary, worn from years of war, his armor dented and singed with the dark stains of past battles. His eyes, a deep and steely gray, carried the weight of the lives he had taken, and those he had failed to save. She rose slowly, clutching her children tighter, as if they were all that kept her from crumbling to dust. The warrior halted a few paces from her. His hand rested loosely on the hilt of his blade, but he did not draw it. Instead, he studied her with a quiet, cautious gaze, as though he could already see the grief that poured from her. "I know who you are," she said, her voice trembling yet resolute. "You are the one they call the Butcher of Tarsus. But today, I do not come to curse you." He said nothing, only watched. "My mate is gone," she continued, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Killed in a war we never wanted. My people are scattered, dying like the embers of a fire that cannot be rekindled. And these," she lowered her gaze to the children at her side, "are all that remain of him." The twins, no more than 5 cycles old, clung to her legs. Their large, luminous eyes peeked out, filled with both curiosity and fear. "I do not ask for pity," she said, her voice breaking. "But if you have any kindness left in you, any shred of mercy, I beg you, take us. Adopt us as your own." The warrior's expression darkened. He turned his head slightly, as if the wind carried words only he could hear. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "I am not what you think," he said at last, his voice rough like stone. "I have taken more lives than I can count. My hands are stained with the blood of your people. What makes you believe I could care for you?" She took a step closer, daring to reach out. Her hand hovered near him, trembling, before she let it fall. "Because I see it in your eyes," she whispered. "You are tired of death." He clenched his jaw. "And if I refuse?" Her shoulders sagged, but her resolve did not falter. "Then we will perish, as many have. But if you choose to help, perhaps something of my people will live on. And perhaps something in you will heal." For a long time, he said nothing, and the wind howled between them. The twins shifted uneasily, their small hands gripping her dress. Finally he knelt, slowly, and removed the gauntlet from one hand. His scarred fingers extended, palm up, towards the children. One of the twins hesitated, glancing up at their mother, who gave a small, encouraging nod. Tentatively, the child reached out, placing a tiny hand in his. The warrior's expression softened, though only slightly. He met the woman's gaze, his eyes tired but no longer cold. "I don't know how to be what you need," he admitted. "Then let us teach each other," she replied, a tear slipping down her cheek. In that barren wasteland, under a sky choked with dust, the human warrior and the alien widow formed a fragile bond. Not out of love, not at first, but out of a shared longing to find something more than war and loss. And as he rose, cradling the smallest of the twins in his arms, the weight on his shoulders seemed just a little lighter. It was the beginning of something neither of them could fully understand, yet both desperately needed. The journey back to his camp was long and grueling. The air was thin, bitter with the acrid scent of ash from distant battles. The warrior walked in silence, his footsteps heavy, but no heavier than the thoughts crowding his mind. The alien widow followed closely, cradling one twin while the other clung to the human's broad shoulders, their small hands gripping the rough fabric of his battle-worn cloak. As they reached the encampment, the scattered remnants of his unit cast wary glances their way. Hardened soldiers, scarred and cynical, murmured to one another, their faces etched with confusion and suspicion. They were not used to seeing their commander with companions, especially not alien children. A grizzled lieutenant, his beard streaked with gray, stepped forward. "Sir, what is this?" His voice was careful, uncertain. "You brought them." The warrior's eyes flicked to the widow, who stood with her head high despite the exhaustion written across her features. "They are under my protection now," he said, his tone brooking no argument. The lieutenant's brow furrowed. "With respect, sir, they're the enemy." "No," the warrior said, his voice like steel. "They are refugees." The camp fell silent. The soldiers exchanged uneasy looks, but no one dared challenge him further. With a curt nod, the warrior led the widow and her children to the center of the camp, where a modest shelter stood, a tent barely large enough for one, let alone four. Inside, the widow lowered herself to the ground, cradling the twins. The warrior lit a small, flickering lamp, its dim light casting long shadows across the canvas walls. He removed his armor piece by piece, each clang of metal on the ground echoing like distant thunder. "They will not harm you," he said finally, his voice softer now. "They fear me too much." The widow met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. "And should they lose their fear?" "They won't," he answered, but the shadows in his eyes betrayed a deeper uncertainty. For a while, they sat in silence, the children curled up beside their mother, already drifting into an exhausted sleep. The warrior watched them, his rough exterior softening as he took in their fragile forms. "What do they call you?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, as if her name held more weight than words should. "Lihara," she said at last. He nodded, rolling the name over in his mind. "I am called Darius." Lihara tilted her head, studying him. "You do not look like the stories." "I imagine I don't," Darius replied with a wry smile. "Stories are often kinder than the truth." "No," she said, her voice gentle. "The stories are cruel." "You are not." He did not respond, merely leaned back against the rough canvas, staring at the ceiling. The weariness in his bones felt deeper than ever, but for the first time in years, it was accompanied by something else, an odd, flickering hope. Days passed, and the camp adjusted, reluctantly at first, to the presence of the alien widow and her children. The twins, curious and fearless, began exploring, their silvery laughter ringing through the camp like the chiming of delicate bells. Darius found himself watching them more often than he should, a quiet wonder softening the hard lines of his face. Lihara, too, settled into the strange new rhythm. She helped where she could, tending to wounds, offering calm words to the broken soldiers. Despite their initial wariness, the men and women of the camp began to accept her presence, not as one of their own, but as something that softened the brutal edges of their lives. One evening, as the suns dipped below the horizon, Darius sat by the fire, the twins curled up asleep in his lap. Lihara sat beside him, her gaze distant but peaceful. "Why did you really take us in?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes. "Because I needed to believe I could still save something," he said after a long pause. "Even if it's just this." She reached out, placing a hand over his. "Then let us save each other." In the quiet of the night, under the canopy of stars, the warrior and the widow sat together, bound by loss, but forging something new, something fragile, yet resilient. And for the first time in years, Darius allowed himself to hope. As the weeks passed, the strange new family wove itself into the rhythm of the camp. Darius remained the hardened leader the soldiers knew, but something about him softened in private moments. The twins, who had once clung to Lihara in fear, now ran freely through the camp, their laughter ringing through the barren landscape like the first signs of life in a long-dead world. One day, a storm swept in from the horizon, thick clouds swirling in shades of deep crimson and indigo. The soldiers scrambled to secure their tents and equipment. Darius, standing by the edge of the camp, watched the skies darken, his instincts sharp as ever. He turned to see Lihara, her silver hair whipping in the wind, guiding the twins into the safety of their tent. Inside, the storm howled, the fabric walls of the tent trembling under the force of the wind. The twins huddled together, wide-eyed, but Lihara remained calm, her voice a soothing balm as she told them a story from her people, a tale of a great phoenix that rose from the ashes of a fallen world. Darius sat nearby, listening in silence, the cadence of her words washing over him like a distant memory of peace. As the storm raged on, a messenger burst into the tent, panting and drenched. "Commander Darius," he cried. "Scouts report movement in the east, enemy forces closing in." Darius rose at once, his armor already half donned. He turned to Lihara, his face a mask of resolve. "Stay here. Keep the children safe." But Lihara stood as well, her eyes fierce. "I will not hide while you fight for us." "You have already fought enough," he said, his voice gentler than before. "Let me do this." Her gaze softened, but she reached out, gripping his arm. "Then promise me you will come back." He hesitated, the words lodging in his throat, but then he nodded. "I promise." The battle that followed was swift and brutal. The enemy, a desperate faction seeking to reclaim the remnants of the fallen world, fought with the recklessness of those who had nothing left to lose. But Darius's soldiers were battle-hardened, and under his command, they repelled the assault with brutal efficiency. As the dust settled and the cries of the wounded echoed in the distance, Darius stood amidst the wreckage, his sword slick with blood, his body weary but unbroken. He scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of a second wave, but none came. Returning to the camp, he found Lihara waiting at the edge, her eyes scanning the battlefield with a desperate intensity. When she saw him, her shoulders sagged in relief, and without hesitation, she ran to him, her arms encircling him tightly. "You kept your promise," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I did," he replied, his arms wrapping around her, the weight of the battle slipping away in her embrace. Behind them, the twins emerged, running to their mother and clinging to Darius's legs. He knelt, pulling them into his arms, his chest tight with emotions he had long buried. For the first time in years, he felt more than the endless ache of war. He felt the warmth of a family. That night, as the camp settled into an uneasy peace, Darius sat by the fire with Lihara and the twins beside him. The stars above were cold and distant, but in that small circle of warmth, there was something new, a fragile but growing sense of belonging. "You saved us," Lihara said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "No," he replied, his voice low. "You saved me." In that moment, under the vast expanse of an alien sky, Darius realized that for all the battles he had fought, this was the only one that had truly mattered. And for the first time, he felt whole. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the camp began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a home. The barren wastelands that once seemed lifeless now held the echoes of laughter, the soft hum of lullabies, and the steady rhythm of peace slowly taking root. Darius, once known only as the Butcher, was no longer feared by those who lived under his protection. The soldiers no longer whispered in wary tones about the alien woman and her children. Instead, they found themselves drawn to the light that Lihara and her twins brought into their midst. The twins had names now, Leora and Kale, and they had found their place among the hardened warriors, who taught them simple games, shared their rations, and protected them like younger siblings. One quiet evening, with the camp bathed in the golden light of a rare, clear sunset, Darius sat atop a small ridge overlooking the plains. Lihara joined him, settling beside him with a peaceful sigh. The twins chased each other nearby, their laughter rising on the warm breeze. "I never thought I would feel this again," Lihara said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Feel what?" Darius asked, his voice gentle. "Hope," she replied, turning to him with a small, serene smile. "You have given that to us." Darius was silent for a moment, his eyes soft as they traced the contours of her face. "You gave me more than I ever thought I could have," he said. "You made me believe I could be something other than a weapon." She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "You are more than that, Darius. You always were." The sunset deepened, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. The twins ran toward them, breathless and flushed with joy, collapsing into their mother's arms. Darius scooped Kale into his lap, ruffling his silver hair as the boy giggled. "Are we safe now?" Leora asked, her luminous eyes wide with curiosity. Darius met Lihara's gaze, then turned back to the child, his voice steady and sure. "Yes," he said. "We are safe." In the weeks that followed, the war faded into the distance. Messages came, peace treaties signed, old enemies laying down their arms. The world, once fractured by conflict, began to heal, just as Darius had begun to heal. The camp was no longer a place of war but a sanctuary, a home for those who had fought and lost, and now sought to rebuild. One evening, beneath a sky scattered with stars, Darius stood with Lihara and the twins at the edge of the camp, looking out at the vast expanse of land stretching endlessly before them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt full of promise. "We'll build something better," Darius said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Lihara leaned into him, her hand resting over his heart. "Together." As the twins laughed and played in the starlight, the warrior who had once been a weapon and the widow who had once been broken stood side by side, their hearts no longer weighed down by loss but lifted by love. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet peace they had fought so hard to find, they knew they had finally come home.